Today is Monday, 18th November 2024, and I'm still in Budapest, where I've had already some very interesting meetings with various people who have been kind enough to give up their time to meet with me and the other members of the party that are here to acquaint ourselves with the views of the Hungarians at this particular time of international tension, and to gauge, by the way, the internal situation in Hungary itself. And of course, the fact that I'm here, the fact that I'm going from one meeting to the other, again, inevitably limits the amount of time I can devote to making to programs. So I once more apologize. People were very kind after the previous video about the lighting conditions. I still feel that they're less than ideal, but there we are. It's the best I can do. This will again be a shorter video than usual. It'll focus on what I consider to be the more important matters that are taking place. And as I said, the lighting conditions are what they are. I can't do much more about them. But anyway, let's now turn to the topics, the subject matter of this program. And inevitably, I find myself obliged to return to the topic that dominated my program yesterday: President Biden's extraordinary, incredibly reckless and irresponsible decision made without apparently consulting the President-elect of the United States, Donald Trump, the decision to authorize use of long-range ATACMS missiles to conduct strikes deep inside Russia. Now, in the last 24 hours, this decision, about which we only know because it's been reported by the New York Times and by Reuters, anyway, this decision has come in for significant criticism, and principally, I should say, in the United States by Donald Trump's supporters. And there is actually a useful summary of much of this criticism in the London Times. So we read, for example, that Trump's eldest son, I'm taking this from the London Times, Donald Trump Jr., posted on X that the military-industrial complex seems to want to make sure they get World War III going before my father has a chance to create peace and save lives. Richard Grenell, Trump's former director of national intelligence and one of his closest foreign policy advisors, criticized the decision, saying Biden was escalating the wars before he leaves office. Grenell said on X, no one anticipated that Joe Biden would escalate the war in Ukraine during the transition period. This is as if he's launching a whole new war. Everything has changed now. All previous calculations are null and void and all for politics. David Sachs, a tech millionaire and major Trump donor, said President Trump won a clear mandate to end the war in Ukraine. So what does Biden do in his final 2 months in office? Massively escalated. Is his goal to hand Trump the worst situation possible? Question mark. And of course, we can answer that question. It's not difficult to answer that question. I answered it yesterday. It is precisely, that is precisely the purpose of this step. It is to hand over to Donald Trump the worst possible situation as soon as he takes office. Now, there's been other criticism by others. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, has also weighed in. I understand that Senator Lee has spoken out against this decision as well. As I said, there's been many criticisms, and I do think these criticisms are fully justified. Putting aside the enormously dangerous and escalatory nature of this decision, I still find it incredible that a president rejected by his own party, leading a party which has been comprehensively defeated in an election held just 2 weeks ago, just over 10 days ago, nonetheless feels that he's in a position to make a decision like this without informing the man who is going to succeed him and who's going to take over in January, the president-elect, in this case, Donald Trump. Now, I say that, I have to say that the history of the United States over the last couple of years is of extremely unsatisfactory transitions. As I once remember, the point of a transition period was that the president in office, once it was clear that a new president would be taking office in his stead, that the president still in office would use the transition period principally in order to smooth the way and to prepare the ground for the next president. It was never assumed or expected that the president in office would take massive decisions like the one that Biden has just taken, massive and controversial decisions, especially without first getting the agreement of the president-elect. In this case, it's clear that the topic was not, the decision was not even discussed. Now, it has to be said that the two previous transitions have not worked like that at all. If we talk about the transition from Obama to Trump, there was, again, an apparently friendly meeting between Obama and Trump in the White House. But in reality, as we now know, officials of the Obama administration were busy preparing to launch and, in fact, quietly already undertaking all sorts of investigations of Donald Trump and of his team, apparently looking for evidence that Donald Trump had won the recent election with help from the Russians. Of course, that proved to be entirely wrong, and that understates the realities of that very difficult and unhappy transition period from Obama to Trump, which included, by the way, a difficult meeting between Donald Trump and the director of the FBI, which led afterwards to the spread of all sorts of salacious stories about Donald Trump himself. Anyway, that was one very unhappy transition. The subsequent transition from Trump to Biden was also controversial, to say the least. In fact, it was a transition which was marked by bitter arguments about the preceding election. And now we've seen this transition in which President Biden this time is making decisions which are clearly intended to make Donald Trump's life as president, when he takes office, as difficult as possible. And in fact, there have been various comments made by all sorts of people that this decision, this latest decision by Joe Biden, shows how dangerous in some respects this transition from one president to another has become. Now, the thread that unites all three of these extremely unstable transitions is, of course, the personality of Donald Trump. He has been involved in every single one of them. And the fundamental reality is that in each case, he has faced strenuous opposition from members of America's political class, and this time it's no different. And President Biden is, of course, a member of that political class. Anyway, enough of that. What about the decision itself? Well, possibly because of the strength of the domestic reaction, the extensive criticism that there has been from the Trump people, but also because of known unhappiness about this decision in the Pentagon, and about that we have been well informed for many months now. Well, since that article in the New York Times, there appear to have been some elements, some attempts to, well, not walk the decision back, but to hedge it around with nuances to make it look as if this is not quite the momentous decision, which it obviously is. Firstly, we are being told, and this is all unofficial because there's been no formal confirmation of anything up to now, we are told that the area, the scope of the potential attacks by the ATACMS missiles will be limited to Kursk region. So far, there is supposedly no plan to attack other facilities in Russia beyond Kursk region itself. And when we speak about Kursk region, we apparently mean the territory where the ongoing fighting in Kursk region is taking place. That is one story that we're hearing at the moment. And of course, the other story that we're hearing is that this isn't really even about the Russians exactly, or even Ukraine. It's really about the North Koreans, that what President Biden and his team want to do is to impress upon the North Koreans the extraordinary danger of getting themselves involved in combat operations in Ukraine, and that this is really intended to deter them. The last argument strikes me as being particularly absurd to the point where it frankly insults the intelligence. Briefly, since we're talking about the North Koreans, we've been hearing for weeks about the North Korean troops who are supposedly assembling in Kursk region, preparing to enter into battle there. So far, and I have to say this again, apart from some claims by the Ukrainians that the North Koreans have been involved in the fighting in some way, though even the Ukrainian reports seem to accept that it is the Ukrainians who have been attacking and killing the North Koreans rather than the other way around. Anyway, apart from these reports from the Ukrainians, which have received no external corroboration, there is no sign so far of any participation by troops from North Korea anywhere in Kursk region, in any part of the fighting. I have long suspected, in fact, to say it simply, I believe that this whole story about the North Korean troops was always intended principally as a media operation in order to justify some act of escalation, both by the Ukrainians and ultimately by the Americans as well. And that exactly is what we are seeing now. It is a story of attacking a phantom force in order to justify not the attack on the phantom force, but the attack itself. Now, the other point to say about the attack on the North Koreans is that this argument that this is some sort of exercise in deterrence, that the North Koreans are going to be deterred from attacking and participating in the war because some ATACMS missiles might be launched at them. It is something which is completely at odds with the entire narrative about North Korea that we have been hearing not just for the last couple of years, but for decades. In fact, ever since the North Korean political system became established in the 1950s. We are being led to think that a government which supposedly has no regard for the life of its citizens is going to be deterred from an action that it has decided to take because a couple of missiles, American missiles, might be lobbed at some of its soldiers, causing losses amongst them. I have to say that, putting aside what Kim Jong-un himself and his officials must make of this, it does seem to me that, not for the first time, parts of the narrative are now starting to contradict each other. A regime supposedly completely unconcerned about human life is about to be deterred out of concern for the human life of some of its soldiers. Anyway, I'm not going to waste more time on this. This whole North Korean story seems to me absurd. To repeat again, I am fully prepared to accept that there are North Korean troops in Russia. I am fully prepared to accept that some of those North Korean troops are close to the contact line, being trained and informed about modern war by the Russians. I am fully prepared to accept that the North Koreans are providing some military and technical assistance to the Russians. And in fact, there is evidence that they are. There has been a recent film which, assuming it is real, which I presume it is, appears to show North Korean self-propelled howitzers trundling westwards towards the front lines. So maybe the North Koreans are there, but this whole narrative about them has been constructed in such a way as to justify the action which has just been taken now. As for the other argument that we are hearing about the fact that the attacks are going to be confined to the Kursk pocket, that they are intended to defeat the Russians there, or to hold the Russians back there, that there's no plan for wider attacks with missiles elsewhere, I take none of that seriously. Briefly, it is the usual story with the United States, or at least with this administration, the Biden administration. They are testing the water. They're taking a major escalatory move. They're waiting to see how the Russians will react. And on the assumption that the next administration continues the same policy, we are likely to see further steps made in the future to broaden the remit of these missile strikes to cover other parts of the battle line. Now, before I get on to what the Russians are going to do, I'm going to also say that there is considerable confusion at the moment about whether the British and the French will be joining in and will be conducting strikes with Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles. I'm going to make the assumption that they are, but the word that is going out at the moment is that no such decision has been made, that the United States, the Biden administration, is holding back on that decision. I don't take that claim seriously. I've no doubt that before long, Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles will be used, or there will be an attempt to use them to conduct strikes against Russia. The limiting factor is not the will to use these systems now that the decision to authorize deep missile strikes has been made. It is the number of Storm Shadow and Scalp missiles that Britain and France can send to Ukraine, and the fact that these are air-launched missiles and that aircraft, fighter jets launching these missiles will have to approach the Russian border, where they will become extremely vulnerable to destruction by the very, very advanced and very powerful Russian air defense system. Now, the Financial Times, as I'm making this program, is running with the story that in Germany there is now a renewed pressure on Chancellor Scholz of Germany to authorize use of Taurus missiles, or rather the supply of Taurus missiles to Ukraine. Chancellor Scholz is currently resisting that pressure. I suspect that he intends to make this an issue in the forthcoming German parliamentary elections. He knows, I think, that German public opinion supports him on this issue. But of course, it is the case that the American decision to authorize deep missile strikes on Russia is going to increase the pressure on Chancellor Scholz in Germany as well. And just to repeat a point that I made in my program yesterday, if the Taurus missiles are supplied to Ukraine, if they are indeed used in the way that these ATACMS, probably the Storm Shadows and the Scolds, are used to conduct deep strikes into Russia, it is not going to make any difference to the war. The New York Times article, which disclosed the decision, concedes as much. Roland Oliphant, writing in the Daily Telegraph, has written a lengthy article essentially saying the same thing. He says that this is too little too late. He makes points about how the HIMARS missiles back in 2022 did make a certain difference in the battlefield. He, however, acknowledges that in response to the HIMARS missiles, the Russians changed their tactics, reducing the effectiveness of the HIMARS missiles. And he also acknowledges that the Russians have been more successful in jamming the HIMARS missiles and intercepting them than had appeared to be the case previously. And Robert Clark in the Daily Telegraph makes exactly the same point, that this is a decision that's been made far too late, on far too small a scale. It cannot change the outcome of the war. To be clear, it never would have changed the outcome of the war, even if it had been made much earlier. It would have further poisoned US-Russian relations had this decision been made earlier. But the United States, Britain, France, and Germany are not in a position to supply missiles of this kind in anything like the quantity needed in order to make a significant difference to the course of the war. There's been lots of weapons supplied at different times by the Western powers to the Ukrainians, and none of them have had the decisive outcome that many people said they would or had anticipated. Now, here I'm going to briefly touch on certain comments made by the Speaker of the lower house of the Russian Parliament, the State Duma, Vyacheslav Volodin, and he makes what I think is a very interesting point, and one which, amidst all of this discussion, people have just overlooked. As for using the aforementioned weapons, that's to say the ATACMS and the Storm Shadows and the Scalps, they are already being used. Certainly the expansion of their use may cause damage, but it will not change the situation on the battlefield. It will only exacerbate Ukraine's fate and future and will completely ruin Russian-American ties. And Volodin went on to say that Biden will pass away at some point. There is an impression that, thinking about this, he's dreaming of eternity and wants to drag all of America along and possibly the entire world. In other words, that he's aiming at some sort of Viking funeral. Well, that may be right or it may be wrong. A funeral which everything is burnt down around Biden. That may be right or it may be wrong. But the other points that Volodin is making are absolutely valid ones. People talk about these weapons, the ATACMS, the Storm Shadows, the Scalps, even ultimately the Taurus missiles, as if weapons like this have not been actively used in the war previous to now. In fact, they have been in use for over a year. The Storm Shadows and the Scalps were first delivered to Ukraine, as I remember, in the late summer, early autumn of 2023, following the defeat of Ukraine's summer counteroffensive. The ATACMS followed a couple of weeks earlier. They've been used extensively since then. And the results, I think it's fair to say, have fallen far short of expectations. When the supply of the ATACMS was first debated in the United States, I remember many people claiming at that time that the ATACMS would be used by the Ukrainians to close all the Russian ports in the Black Sea, and specifically in Crimea itself, and would put Crimea under some kind of siege, and that this would enable the Ukrainians to recapture Crimea as the Russian military in Crimea, and presumably, by the way, the civilian population ran out of supplies. And of course, as we know, nothing like that ever happened. Going back to Brian Beletic at the New Atlas, he correctly pointed out in several videos that when Storm Shadows and Scalp missiles and the odd ATACMS were used and did do actual damage on various facilities in Russian ports, the effort used to achieve that outcome was so great that it basically demonstrated that the entire theory behind the supply of these weapons, that Crimea could be isolated in that way, was simply unworkable. And he is obviously right. And of course, the use of the Storm Shadows, the Scalp missiles, the ATACMS missiles, even if we're now going to get a more advanced or a more long-range ATACMS missile supplied to Ukraine, we don't know that for a fact, but some people are suggesting this. Anyway, the supply of all of these missiles means that the Russians by now have developed countermeasures. They've had plenty of time to develop countermeasures and to think out how to respond to these particular systems. And that's exactly what they are going to do. They've created point defense systems that will have successfully defended the Crimean Bridge. They will no doubt do the same for the two nuclear power plants, the Zaporozhye and Kursk nuclear power plant. They will do all of these things. This does not add a capability that has not existed previously. What it does do is cross a Russian red line. And Putin has gone to great lengths to explain why. His point is that these are missiles which Ukraine can only use when the targeting and guidance data has been prepared by Western technicians. If missiles of this kind are launched into what even the Western powers acknowledge is Russian territory, then that is an act of war by the Western countries against Russia. And Peskov, Putin's spokesman, has just reaffirmed this position, the position that Putin set out. And this is what he said when he spoke to reporters today. If such a decision has indeed been formulated and communicated to the Kiev regime, then, of course, this is a qualitatively new round of escalation of tensions and a qualitatively new situation in terms of the involvement of the United States in this conflict. We are proceeding from this. Moscow's position should be absolutely clear to everyone. These signals have been received by the collective West, and they were voiced by President Putin in St. Petersburg, which is, of course, where he explained why the Russians would react as strongly to the use of these weapons as they will no doubt now do. The point about these weapons is that they are not going to change the course of the war in Ukraine, but because they will amount to attacks on Russian territory by the US, British, French, and perhaps ultimately German militaries, they will be acts of war by those countries against Russia, and this will have a qualitative effect on relations between Russia and those countries. Russia will no doubt from this point on see these countries as having committed acts of war against itself, and it will respond and take action in future accordingly. Now, that doesn't mean that the Russians are going to rush off and start hurling nuclear bombs and conducting nuclear strikes onto Western territory, but they will, from this point on, see these Western countries as countries that have conducted attacks on Russian territory itself, and the Russians will feel that will no longer feel the same inhibitions about providing weapons, technology, data, information to friendly countries that find themselves in an adversarial position with Britain, France, the United States, and possibly Germany as well. So, if an American aircraft carrier is operating in the Persian Gulf, conceivably preparing to target Iran, then that American aircraft carrier could become the target of Iranian missiles supplied to Iran by the Russians with the guidance systems and the targeting systems prepared by the Russians. Up to this time, the Russians probably have been providing a certain amount of assistance and technology to countries like Iran and to other regional actors. But one has always sensed that they have exercised restraints over their allies in the use of these weapons and systems, and that can no longer be relied upon in future. So American lives, British, French, and potentially German lives are now going to be put at risk because of an irresponsible decision made in the way that I have discussed, to no possible gain in respect of the war in Ukraine, for all the various reasons that I, Rick Grinnell, Roland Oliphant, the writers at the New York Times, Robert Clark in the Telegraph as well, scores of others, officials in the Pentagon have already said. As I said, a bizarre, extraordinary decision, and one which will cause all sorts of problems in the future. Now, I've already said that, in my opinion, a lot of what is driving this decision is the deep anger of the president himself and of members of his team at the fact that they lost the election, that the president wasn't even allowed to fight the election, that Donald Trump is going to be the next president, and, by the way, that the Russians are going to win the war in Ukraine. To the president and his team, it must seem as if all of the decisions, all of the things that they tried to do since the president's inauguration back in January 2021, that everything there is falling apart around their ears. And of course, it's unsurprising that people who find that, who feel that way, are acting out of anger. But Decisions in anger are made in anger are repented at leisure. Political leaders have no right to allow anger, pure anger, mere anger, to influence their decisions. Unfortunately, it is likely that the people who will repent this decision are going to be American, British, French, perhaps German servicemen and women, not those people who took this decision, who will, of course, politically speaking, move on. Now, there is a possibility that Donald Trump will reverse this decision when he becomes president. He has been very careful to say nothing. And I think, by the way, that that is the correct decision. I'm sure that to some extent this is a trap, another one of those traps, which his political opponents in the United States continuously lay for him. They're basically baiting him to come out publicly, criticize this decision and say that he will reverse it. If he does, of course, they will then say that he prefers Russia to the United States, that he's loyal to Putin in some way, things of that kind. Given that Trump cannot reverse the decision now, the wisest course for him is to say as little as possible and wait until February when he can quietly reverse it. And I think that is the correct thing for him to do, though I would say that when his own son and people like Rick Grinnell speak out against the decision in the way they have, that makes me reasonably sure that he does intend eventually to reverse it. Anyway, that's what I think about this shabby affair. It is undoubtedly the case, as several people are saying, that the decision reflects panic and desperation as the Russian military continues its grinding advance in Ukraine itself. I understand, though I have not been able to follow events on the battlefronts quite in as much detail as I formerly could whilst I was in London. Anyway, I understand that the Russian army continues its advance. There is a long article in TASS, published by the Russian news agency TASS, which speaks of the Russian army having practically surrounded the Ukrainian garrison in Chasiv Yar. And of course, the huge Russian missile attack that took place 2 days ago appears to have done massive further damage to Ukraine's energy system. So it is undoubtedly a decision born of anger and of desperation, but these are bad counselors. No one in a position of political responsibility should allow themselves to make decisions influenced by those sort of factors. But of course, the current president and his officials were unable to resist those emotions. Well, the conflict in Ukraine is not the only thing that is taking place in the world. But before I finish this discussion, can I just say that there have been 2 very interesting articles which I want to touch on. One is by Eve Smith in Naked Capitalism, which I would strongly urge people to read. It looks beyond this issue of the attack, of the potential strikes, deep strikes into Russia. Its title is As Biden Uses Long-Range Strikes into Russia to Create Problems for Trump. What else might happen with Ukraine when Trump takes over? And E. Smith, like me, takes the view or leans to the view that Donald Trump will follow through on what he has been saying repeatedly in public and what his various supporters, his team, have been saying, that he's going to try to find some means to bring the conflict in Ukraine to an end, or at least American involvement in that conflict to an end. But there remains the unresolved problem, the unresolved issue of what the final outcome, the final desired outcome from a Russian point of view is, the nature of the Russian endgame, how the Russians conceive of their victory in Ukraine. And as it happens, Glenn Deason and myself did a live stream, a program with the Russian journalist and scholar Fyodor Lukyanov, in which he discussed that very thing. Mr. Lukyanov is a very well-connected and well-informed person in Moscow. And Glenn Deason also said that his sense when he attended the Valdai conference in Sochi is that there are increasing questions being asked in Russia itself about what the end game to the war is, with nobody yet having a clear answer to that question. Anyway, it's going to be a very, very important discussion. And Eve Smith has started to consider some of the policies followed by both the Soviet Union and the Western powers in Germany after the end of the Second World War, to see whether perhaps these examples might lead to some kind of solution. She, I think it's fair to say, takes the view that ultimately the preferred strategy of the Russians today is, if they can find a negotiated solution, it is to negotiate it with the Ukrainians rather than with the Western powers, who are probably agreement incapable. But that, of course, brings us back to the intractable question of who in Ukraine the Russians could negotiate with. And this is where Soviet and perhaps even more Western policy in post-war Germany might provide some useful and interesting lessons. Anyway, I found it an interesting article and I would recommend it. The other article which I found very interesting is the article by Ian Proud, former British diplomat, person who has been based in Moscow, writer of A Misfit in Moscow, which is his very vivid description of what his experiences were as a diplomat posted to Moscow in the British Embassy. Anyway, Ian Proud makes what is undoubtedly the correct point, which is that given the way in which this decision has been made by President Biden just 2 months before he's due to leave office, in fact, just as I understand it, more like 6 weeks before, just about 8 weeks before, rather, he's due to leave office, it really doesn't make much sense for Putin and the Russians to engage in major escalatory moves at this time, given that at the moment there is a reasonable chance that when Trump takes over, this decision is going to be reversed. Better for the Russians not to fall into the trap of engaging in disproportionate counter-escalation until they know what Donald Trump is going to do. Ian Proud does warn against complacency. He also says that it is impossible politically for President Putin to simply disregard this decision. And we've seen from Peskov's words, that the Russians are not, in fact, going to disregard it. But there will be a Russian response, but the Russians could slow walk it, and they could calibrate it at a level that would make it possible for some kind of negotiation or agreement or discussion to take place with Trump and his team after they enter the White House, with a view to trying to de-escalate tensions entirely and to get this decision reversed. And that is my own instinct as well. This decision coming at the tail end of what has been a disastrous and failed presidency should not be allowed to take over the whole direction of international relations. Doing that would play directly into the hands of those irresponsible people who have made this decision, enabling them to create that escalatory crisis, which is what they are now obviously trying to do. So, again, I think this is a fine article by Ian Proud. You can find it on his Substack blog. Its title is Why Putin Won't Go Nuclear Following the ATACMS Decision. And again, I agree with it, and I think this is a good article on this topic. Now, I ought to say that Ian Proud has not just written what I think is a very, very fine article on this whole subject, but he's also made some really rather interesting points about the whole nature of Western policy. And these are worth reading, as is this particular observation by Eve Smith, which is not directly concerning this decision to launch missile strikes, but which is about Western policy as a whole, including the effect of the sanctions. And this is by Eve Smith. It is frustrating but predictable that the mainstream press and commentary glosses over the fact that the EU's economic duress is the direct result of its actions. The US led Europe down what John Mearsheimer calls the Primrose Path by convincing itself and its EU camp followers that Russia would quickly collapse under economic sanctions, and that if Russians were dragooned into fighting, they'd run away as soon as they faced Western wonder weapons and supermen. When that did not work out, Plan B largely amounted to doing Plan A harder, including blowing up the Nord Stream pipelines. Yet the Anglosphere, and one assumes the mainstream European press, and by the way, as somebody who follows the mainstream European press, that assumption, as we will see, is absolutely right, depicts high energy prices and the resulting economic weakness and rising citizen unhappiness as if they just happened, as opposed to being the results of actions to cut off Europe from cheap Russian energy. And that is absolutely correct. There is a fundamental refusal to acknowledge that it was the Europeans themselves who, by cutting themselves off from access to cheap Russian energy sources, have provoked the crisis in their own economies that they are experiencing now, with all of the political instability that comes in its wake. It has been an astonishing performance, a denial of reality, and to anticipate various people, in fact every single person that I have so far met in Budapest and whom I have discussed this question with, and it comes up repeatedly and all the time. Well, here at least they are baffled by it. Anyway, let's move on to the next and last topic that I'm going to discuss in this video today. And that is the meeting that took place, the very final meeting that took place between President Biden and Xi Jinping at the APAC summit in Lima. And the Chinese have provided us with a very, very interesting readout of this meeting. Now, the Americans have also provided a readout, but as this is a relatively short video, or shorter video than usual, I'm going to skip discussing the American readout, which basically sets out Biden's views about how wonderfully well the relationship between China and the United States is proceeding, and then goes on to set out all the usual boilerplate grievances that we've heard from all sorts of people in the United States recited endlessly and all the time. As is so often the case, it is the Chinese readout that is much more interesting. And to anticipate, I would say that it is the toughest readout that the Chinese have produced up to now of any discussion between Xi Jinping and Biden. Now, as is always the way with the language of Chinese readouts, the language of this one is measured, but it's difficult to avoid the conclusion that Xi Jinping basically threw the book at Biden. And indeed, he did more than that, as we shall see. So let's go to what this readout says. And just to say that there are some nice words at the beginning. Xi Jinping is reported to have told Biden that despite all the problems, the ups and downs, well, the worst was avoided, and China and the United States were able to avoid a conflict between them, and that must be counted as some kind of success. But then Xi Jinping, according to the Chinese readout, prepared to read a lesson to Joe Biden. And he listed 7 points. And I will read what the Chinese readout says. First, it is important to have a correct strategic perception. The Thucydides trap is not a historical inevitability. A new Cold War should not be fought and cannot be won. Containing China is unwise, unacceptable, and bound to fail. Now, the Thucydides trap originates from a single sentence in the ancient Greek historians Thucydides' monumental study of the war between Athens and Sparta that took place in the 5th century before Christ. And I've discussed the Thucydides trap in many places, including very recently in a video that I did with Sophia Midkiff for Small Town Voice. And I said in that video that the Thucydides trap, if you're familiar with your Thucydides, does not actually exist in Thucydides' own writing. People have taken one isolated sentence and have misconstrued it to mean that in any situation where there is a great power which sees another great power rising, that means that a conflict between those two great powers is inevitable. I said that was not Thucydides' intention at all. He never suggested any degree of inevitability. He was absolutely not a historical determinist. I said that Thucydides always argued that statesmen, that political leaders have options. And here we see, about 2 weeks after Sophia Midkiff and I discussed the Thucydides trap, that Xi Jinping is giving the identical lesson to Joe Biden, who of course will pay no attention. Then Xi Jinping goes on to say this: it is important to match words with actions. A man cannot establish himself without credibility. China has always honored its words. If the US side always says one thing but does another, it will be detrimental to its own image and undermine trust between China and the United States. So again, Xi Jinping is basically telling Biden, you have been lying to me. You've been lying to me repeatedly in meeting after meeting, in assurance after assurance that you've given to me about Taiwan and other things. You always come and you imply that you want a good relationship between us, but your actions are at variance with your words. And then Xi Jinping goes on to say, third, it is important to treat each other as equals. And as two major countries, neither China nor the United States should seek to remodel the other according to one's own will, suppress the other from the so-called position of strength, or deprive the other of the legitimate right to development so as to maintain its leading status. Well, that again is an argument against containment, but it is also a clear-cut rejection of the entire neocon doctrine that the United States not only has a right, but even a duty to reshape the political systems of other countries in order to suit itself. And then Xi Jinping goes on to say, it is important not to challenge red lines and paramount principles. And of course, the United States never accepts the red lines of other countries. But in this case, the Chinese, like the Russians before, say that yes, they do have red lines. They have red lines over Taiwan and the South China Sea and the East China Sea and all sorts of other matters. And the United States is under an obligation to respect those red lines, because a failure to do so will result in a crisis. Fifth, it is important to conduct more dialogue and cooperation. And Xi Jinping here says that under the current circumstances, common interests between China and the United States are expanding rather than shrinking. Cooperation is therefore crucial. But of course, we know that the United States never likes to conduct dialogue and cooperation. Its policy, at least the policy of the Biden administration, has been that it dictates and lectures and the other side listens and does it as it is told, or if it fails to do that, then it is punished. And then there is the sixth comment, which is that it is important to respond to the expectations of people, and that both sides should therefore aim to maintain peace. And the seventh principle, it is important to step forward to shoulder responsibilities of countries. And of course, the United States and China should treat each other as equals, which again is fundamentally incompatible with Joe Biden's thinking. So, what Xi Jinping is doing is he's summing up the way in which Biden has conducted himself and his administration have conducted the critical relationship between China and the United States. In fact, earlier in the readout, Xi Jinping actually makes the point. He says that since this is going to be their last meeting, this is a good opportunity for China to, for the two sides to review the way in which the relationship has developed during the period that Biden has been president of the United States. And it is not difficult to see that Xi Jinping is basically telling Biden, you have made a terrible job of the whole thing. You've acted in completely the wrong way. You've lied. You've deceived China, you've not treated it as an equal, you've sought to contain it, you've destabilized the whole relationship, and you've left the relationship in a worse state than the one it was in when you became president. Anyway, the Chinese are not only throwing the book at Biden, but in this readout and in the statements that they're saying, they're giving a warning to the forthcoming Trump administration. China has its red lines. It has its fundamental principles. It does not like to be lied to. It does not like to be pushed about. Obviously, there are points of contention between China and the United States. The Chinese know that, but what they're looking for is a straightforward relationship based on dialogue. They would prefer to cooperate with the United States to resolve problems, but they do want their interests respected. Now, whether the Trump administration is going to take a different approach to China remains to be seen. There are very, very strong anti-China hardliners within the new Trump team. Marco Rubio, others as well. Mike Waltz, others as well. We will see. But I'm going to say this. If we go back and look at what happened in the first 2 years of Donald Trump's first administration, he does seem at that time to have made a serious effort to at least come to genuine understandings with the Chinese, even as he pursued an economic divorce. If Trump returns to that approach, then I think we could actually see some stabilization, restabilization in the relationship. The Chinese won't be happy at some of the economic steps he may take. They won't like his tariffs, for example. But it will probably not lead to a complete collapse in the relationship. On the contrary, dialogue and cooperation on mutually important issues will continue. But of course, if the new Trump administration continues to treat China in the way that the former Biden administration did, then not only will its policies fail, but the relationship with China will just go on deteriorating at an even faster pace than it has done over the last 4 years. So, an interesting set of points from Xi Jinping to Biden. Of course, Biden is not going to pay any attention. He never has. And besides, he's on his way out. But I do get the sense that Xi Jinping probably, after many frustrating meetings with Biden, wanted to get this off his chest. And of course, he has now done so. And by doing so, he's also giving Donald Trump to understand that he and China are not going to be pushed around. Well, we have seen this video, in effect, is about the way in which the United States, during Joe Biden's time, has disastrously mismanaged the relationship between with the two rival superpowers, Russia and China. The effect, of course, having been to bring China and Russia into an even closer relationship than might have otherwise been the case. Just saying. But anyway, that is what the Chinese think. They are also now preparing for Donald Trump, as are the Russians. The Russians have to navigate this very difficult 2.5-month transition period in which Biden looks like he's going to be working hard to make the situation as bad as possible, if only so as to cause trouble for Trump. And the Chinese, for their part, are making it now very clear that they're utterly sick of the Biden administration and delighted to see it go. The Chinese, by the way, have also issued statements making it very clear that they strongly disapprove of the Biden administration's decision to authorize missile strikes on Russia. So anyway, this is where I finish my program today. It's a little longer than the one I made yesterday, but perhaps it's not the full length of the videos that I tend to make nowadays. I will try and do another video tomorrow, though let me stress again, time is short, and tomorrow I'm going to have a particularly busy day, as we will be generally on the Duran. But nonetheless, I will do my best to do another video tomorrow, though it may be again a much shorter one. Until then, this is the point where I wish you all a very good day. Remind you that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X, that you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar by going to our shop, links under this video, and that if you like this video, you can press the like button and check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.